There are moments in history when entire empires pivot on a single decision. One night, one choice, one breath held between survival and destruction. For Lucky Luciano, that night came quietly, wrapped in the ordinary sounds of a New York evening. No headlines warned of it. No witnesses understood it. But in the dim glow of a smoke-filled room, surrounded by men who would kill him as easily as obey him, Luciano made a choice that would redefine the Mafia, reshape America's criminal landscape, and alter the course of his own destiny. It began with a silence so sharp it felt like a blade. Luciano sat at a table with his closest associates, the weight of a dozen rivalries pressing on his shoulders. He was a man caught between two worlds, the brutal traditions of the old Sicilian order and the ruthless opportunities of modern America. He knew the underworld could not survive the way it had always operated. The Mafia was splintered, locked in endless feuds, ruled by bosses whose pride mattered more than profit. And above all of them loomed Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, two tyrants whose war was dragging the entire underworld toward collapse. Luciano understood this better than anyone. If nothing changed tonight, everything would fall apart tomorrow. The room smelled of tobacco and tension. Conversation stalled. Every man waited for Luciano to speak, but he let the silence work for him. Silence could reveal nerves, expose doubts, force men to confront the fears they tried to hide. In that silence he studied the faces around him, loyal, ambitious, unpredictable. Men he would trust with his life, and men he would one day have to eliminate. The underworld was built on shifting sand. Tonight he needed to turn it into stone. The decision he was about to make was treacherous, dangerous, unforgivable by old-world standards. But it was also necessary. Luciano saw what others refused to see. The Mafia could not survive as a medieval relic. It needed structure. It needed diplomacy. It needed vision. And that vision required something unthinkable, the removal of the very bosses who held the reins of power. He felt the gravity of the decision tightening around him like a noose. Betrayal was a word Sicilians did not forgive. Maranzano and Masuria had built their power on the promise that loyalty was absolute, eternal, unquestioned. But Luciano understood a deeper truth. Loyalty without logic destroys everything it touches. And tonight, logic demanded revolution. He finally spoke, his voice low, steady, unwavering. He outlined the future, a Mafia run not by tyrants but by businessmen, a network instead of a monarchy, an empire built on order rather than chaos. But before that future could be born, the old world had to die. The men around him listened, their expressions tightening, their hearts racing. They knew what he was proposing. They understood the blood that would be spilled. But they also recognized the brilliance of it. Luciano wasn't just trying to survive, he was trying to transform. This was the razor-thin line between genius and destruction, and Luciano walked it with the calm of a man who had faced death before and learned not to flinch. Outside, New York pulsed with its usual midnight rhythm. Taxis speeding, horns echoing, men and women drifting between bars and alleyways. The city was alive, oblivious to the storm that would soon reshape its darkest corners. Somewhere across town, Masuria met with his lieutenants, confident in his untouchable rule. Maranzano, in another borough, rechecked his lists of enemies, unaware that his own name belonged at the top. And there sat Luciano at the heart of it all, preparing to pull the thread that would unravel both kingdoms. He thought of the years spent surviving the streets, learning that fear could be controlled, that loyalty could be negotiated, that power was not about force but foresight. Every lesson he had learned, every bruise, every betrayal, every calculated risk, had brought him to this moment. One decision. One night. One irreversible step. When he finally rose from the table, the men followed him with the solemn awareness that history was shifting beneath their feet. Luciano did not need to shout or threaten. His certainty was enough. His clarity was enough. His vision was enough. In that moment, the future Mafia was born, not in blood but in thought. Blood would come later, of course. Betrayal would carve its path. Bodies would fall. But the revolution began with an idea. That power must evolve or die. This night, quiet, hidden, almost invisible, was the turning point. The moment a street kid became a strategist became a leader, and a leader became the architect of an empire. Lucky Luciano's destiny, and the destiny of organized crime, changed with that single decision. And when history looks back on his life, it will not be the violence that defines him. It will be the mind that dared to reshape the world around him, starting with one night, one choice, and the courage to break the rules that no one else would. Before Lucky Luciano reshaped the underworld into a disciplined machine, New York's criminal landscape was a battlefield stitched together by grudges, fear, and ancient loyalties. It was a world built on vendettas older than America itself, Sicilian feuds transported across the ocean and reborn in tenement hallways and grimy saloons. Nothing was unified. Nothing was organized. Every corner of the city belonged to a different clan, a different boss, a different interpretation of honor. The Mafia was not an empire. It was a patchwork of fragile thrones balanced on blood and mistrust. These early bosses ruled with brute force. Their power came not from strategy but from superstition and lineage. Men followed them out of fear or because they shared the same village, the same dialect, the same family name. Leadership was inherited, not earned. Violence replaced conversation. Revenge replaced logic. And loyalty, while sacred in theory, was often shattered by pride and paranoia. At the center of this fragile world were two types of leaders: the traditionalists clinging to the old ways and the opportunists who saw the American streets but thought with Sicilian minds. Neither group understood the new world rising around them. The weight of old-world feud Sicilian clans carried their vendettas like heirlooms. Arguments born in distant villages survived the voyage to America and resurfaced in the crowded streets of New York. A fight that once involved two families in Palermo now involved dozens of men across multiple boroughs. Murders were committed without context, without future, and without benefit. Bloodshed wasn't business, it was inheritance. These feuds drained resources, sowed instability, and crippled any attempt at cooperation. If one boss tried to negotiate peace, another reignited conflict to prove his dominance. No one trusted anyone outside their bloodline. No one believed profit mattered more than pride. The Mafia wasn't growing. It was eating itself alive. Prohibition, a flood of money, a flood of chaos. Then came Prohibition. In 1920, the 18th Amendment banned alcohol nationwide, and a new opportunity exploded across the underworld. Suddenly, bootlegging turned petty criminals into millionaires. Speakeasies bloomed like wildflowers. Smugglers crossed borders. Politicians took bribes. The streets surged with cash. But opportunity without leadership is chaos. The Mafia had never seen money like this. And instead of organizing it, they fought over it. Gangs hijacked each other's trucks. Rival crews sabotaged shipments. Bottles were smashed not by police, but by competitors desperate to dominate territories. The profits were enormous. The violence was uncontrollable. With every week that passed, more bodies appeared in alleys, on stairwells, outside bars. Murders became signatures. Retaliations became routine. Prohibition should have made the Mafia powerful. Instead, it exposed how unprepared they were for the scale of the opportunity. Bosses who ruled through fear. The men in charge were not builders. They were tyrants. Figures like Joe Masuria and other early dons imposed their rule through raw intimidation. Their power came from the ability to strike quickly, punish harshly, and demand unquestioned obedience. They saw no value in negotiation, innovation, or partnership. To them, respect meant kneeling. Leadership meant yelling the loudest. And fear was not a strategy, it was a weapon used until it broke in their hands. They didn't care about structure. They didn't care about long-term vision. They didn't care about the future of the Mafia. They cared only about themselves. Fear is a powerful tool, but without logic it collapses. Men feared their bosses, but they did not trust them. Fear creates obedience but never stability. And in a world suddenly flooded with prohibition profits, instability meant war. Disunity as a death sentence. By the mid-1920s, New York's Mafia was on the brink of tearing itself apart. The city's Italian underworld was split into factions that operated like rival kingdoms. Every family defended its turf, its traditions, its grudges. No one wanted peace. No one wanted change. No one understood the danger of fighting a war inside a gold mine. The more fractured the Mafia became, the more vulnerable it was, to law enforcement, to political pressure, to internal collapse. Profits were slipping through cracks created by stubborn old-world thinking. Younger gangsters watched money being wasted, opportunities being destroyed, potential being drowned in blood. Whispers of rebellion began to spread. Whispers of modernization. Whispers of a new kind of leader. The old bosses didn't hear them, or refused to listen. A world waiting for a mind like Luciano. Before Luciano ever stepped forward, the conditions for his rise were already forming. The Mafia was desperate for change but blind to it. The underworld needed someone who could break the cycle of vendettas, unify scattered clans, and convert chaos into structure. Someone who saw beyond tradition, who understood American opportunity, who recognized that criminal empires could be built with the same intelligence as legitimate corporations. The underworld did not need another tyrant. It needed a strategist. It needed a mind that could see what others couldn't. Lucky Luciano would become that mind, the first to treat crime as business instead of blood feud, the first to see allies instead of enemies across ethnic lines, the first to understand that power comes from structure, not superstition. He saw a world where bosses ruled from fragile thrones, constantly threatened by their own pride and paranoia. And he realized something radical. If the Mafia continued this way, it would die. If he changed it, it could become unstoppable. Before Luciano, the Mafia was a storm without direction, violent, loud, aimless. After Luciano, it would become an empire. But that transformation could only begin because the world before him was broken, divided, and doomed to collapse without someone bold enough to rebuild it. Before Lucky Luciano became the mind that reshaped the American underworld, he was simply Salvatore Lucania, a skinny immigrant boy stepping into a world that seemed determined to swallow him. The Lower East Side of New York was not a neighborhood. It was a pressure chamber where hunger, violence, and desperation fused into something brutal and unrelenting. Tenements overflowed with families who carried old-world customs and new-world fears. Children grew up fast or they didn't grow up at all. For young Salvatore, hunger was not just physical, it was psychological. Hunger for safety. Hunger for belonging. Hunger for a future where he wasn't stepped on, mocked, or ignored. America promised opportunity, but the streets he walked delivered only struggle. His father worked himself to exhaustion. His mother stretched meals beyond their limits. And Salvatore learned early that survival required more than hard work. It required understanding the shadows around him. The boys in the neighborhood hunted weakness like wolves. Accent, shoes, shirt, posture, anything could mark you as prey. Salvatore was small, foreign, and broke, the perfect target for bullies and older boys looking for amusement. They pushed him, stole from him, beat him, and laughed. But beneath every bruise, Salvatore was learning. He wasn't just fighting to survive. He was studying how survival worked. He learned that fear made some boys reckless. He learned that anger made others sloppy. He learned that silence, the thing he had been taught as a Sicilian virtue, could be used as a weapon. Instead of reacting with rage, he observed. Instead of striking blindly, he calculated. He watched how groups formed, how leaders emerged, how weakness spread like scent in the air. Salvatore discovered something that would become the cornerstone of his life. Power comes from understanding human nature. By age 10, he understood more about people than most grown men. Loyalty as currency. As he grew older, Salvatore drifted into small hustles. Not because he wanted trouble, but because trouble was unavoidable. Running errands for street crews, delivering packages, collecting debts, and offering protection for a price were not choices, they were necessities. In these early jobs, he discovered the value of loyalty, not the romanticized loyalty preached by old country elders, but a transactional loyalty rooted in mutual benefit. The men he worked for rewarded reliability. They respected honesty. They remembered favors. Salvatore learned that loyalty wasn't something you demanded, it was something you earned and traded like currency. He realized that loyalty could shape alliances, shield you from danger, and elevate you from the pack. It wasn't about friendship. It was about value, how useful you were, how smart you were, how dependable you were when chaos hit. This worldview hardened as he watched betrayals unfold around him. He saw friends turn on each other for pennies. He saw bosses abandon their men. He saw how quickly loyalty evaporated when fear entered the equation. And it was fear, not money, that ruled these streets. Fear as leverage. Fear surrounded young Luciano like fog. But while others drowned in it, he learned to breathe through it. He understood which boys used fear to hide their insecurity, which men threatened violence to mask their incompetence, and which gang bosses relied on fear because they lacked intelligence. Fear, he realized, could be shaped. If you understood what a man feared most, humiliation, poverty, betrayal, death, you could predict his behavior before he acted. You could influence him without raising your voice. You could control a room without lifting a finger. This insight became Luciano's secret weapon. It was the first real power he ever held. The meeting that changed everything, Meyer Lansky. But the defining moment of his youth came during a street fight he didn't start. Salvatore saw a smaller boy, a Jewish kid, standing alone against a much larger bully. The smaller boy refused to back down. His eyes showed calculation, not fear. His calmness reminded Salvatore of himself. That boy was Meyer Lansky. After the fight broke up, the two met, and something rare happened on the streets of the Lower East Side: mutual recognition. Each saw in the other a mind sharpened by hardship, a hunger not for chaos but for control, a vision beyond petty hustles. Their friendship became one of the most important alliances in American crime history, but at the time, They were just two kids who understood each other in ways no one else did. Lansky taught Luciano the mathematics of survival, odds, percentages, patterns. Luciano showed Lansky the psychology of influence, reading faces, sensing deception, managing emotional tension. Together they became more than friends. They became a system. Enter Bugsy Siegel. Fire to their ice. If Lansky was the strategist and Luciano the psychologist, Bugsy Siegel was the spark. Wild, fearless, impulsive, Siegel brought an energy neither of them possessed. He acted fast, hit hard, and didn't hesitate. Luciano saw value in that. Every brain needed a blade. Every plan needed a force of nature capable of doing the things others couldn't. Siegel admired Luciano's calm dominance. Luciano admired Siegel's fearless execution. And Lansky served as the balance, keeping the trio grounded through logic. These three boys, barely teenagers, represented the future of organized crime long before they understood it. Each brought something essential. Each filled a void the others lacked. Together, they were dangerous in a way the old bosses couldn't comprehend. Ambition, the only escape by his early teens, Luciano knew what he wanted: out. Out of poverty. Out of insignificance. Out of the powerless life immigrants were expected to live. But he understood that escape required more than luck. It required ambition, sharp, relentless ambition. He wasn't driven by greed. He was driven by survival. By the hunger to never again feel small, forgotten, or afraid. And as the boys around him fell into crime without purpose, Luciano climbed with purpose. Every job he took improved his understanding. Every threat he faced expanded his resilience. Every betrayal strengthened his strategy. A worldview solidified inside him. Loyalty is currency. Fear is leverage. Ambition is the only freedom. This worldview didn't just shape him, it built him. The street kid named Salvatore Lucania was becoming someone else. He was becoming Lucky Luciano. The Prohibition era did not simply open the door to opportunity, it blew the door off its hinges. As alcohol vanished from the legal market, it resurfaced through shadow routes carved by smugglers, gangsters, corrupt policemen, and desperate politicians. Money flooded the streets in torrents. Small-time crooks became businessmen overnight. But while others scrambled for quick profit, Lucky Luciano saw something deeper beneath the chaos: the chance to build an empire unlike anything the underworld had ever seen. He understood immediately that prohibition wasn't just about liquor. It was about influence, infrastructure, and innovation. Whoever controlled the systems behind the alcohol, the transport, the storage, the protection, the distribution, would control the future. But no one man, no single clan, no isolated ethnic group had the reach to seize everything. The world was changing too fast for tribal thinking. And Luciano, already thinking far ahead of the old world bosses, sensed the shift before anyone else. He realized that the old rules were obsolete. And he was ready to write new ones. Breaking barriers. The first multinational empire up until this point, Italian gangsters worked only with Italians, Jewish gangs stuck together, and Irish mobs kept to themselves. Distrust was the invisible border separating every block of New York. But Luciano didn't see borders, he saw opportunity. He saw that Jews brought financial genius, Irish gangs controlled politics and unions, Italians held deep neighborhood influence, and each group's strengths could fill the other's weaknesses. So he did the unthinkable, he unified them. With Meyer Lansky, the calm mathematician who understood risk better than anyone, Luciano forged a partnership built on intelligence rather than ethnicity. Lansky knew where to move money, how to calculate odds, and how to turn booze into a predictable, scalable industry. Bugsy Siegel, wild and impulsive, added the force and daring required for risky operations. Together, the trio formed the nucleus of a revolutionary idea: crime not as a feud-driven tradition but as a business network. It was the underworld's first true corporation. Charm in the front, strategy in the back. Luciano's secret weapon was not brutality, it was charm. He had the dangerous gift of making people feel valued, understood, and essential. He could sit in a room with a Jewish gambler, an Irish dockworker, a Sicilian capo, and a corrupt politician, and each would walk away believing Luciano spoke their language. But beneath the smooth surface, every word was strategic. He presented himself as approachable, reasonable, open to ideas, a stark contrast to the tyrants who ruled with fists and fear. Men trusted him because he listened. Men followed him because he saw the future they couldn't imagine. But charm alone wasn't enough. Luciano built his rise with ruthless clarity. He removed obstacles quietly, never with spectacle. He identified threats before they materialized. He cut ties without hesitation when loyalty turned into liability. His hands might not have carried the gun, but his decisions loaded every bullet fired during that era. Modernizing criminal operations while others treated bootlegging like a temporary hustle, Luciano treated it like an industry. He implemented efficiency with almost corporate discipline. Centralized warehouses, fixed pricing, reliable supply chains, standardized pay structures, partnerships that reduced conflict, bribery budgets to keep politicians satisfied. He eliminated redundant violence, which saved money. He encouraged cooperation, which expanded territory. He introduced rational planning, which stabilized profits. The prohibition underworld shifted from a wild scramble into a smooth-running machine, because Luciano was thinking like a CEO while everyone else still thought like street soldiers. His network grew so vast that even men who hated him ended up relying on him. Vendors needed his protection. Distributors needed his connections. Politicians needed his money. Luciano became the quiet center of power, the one man whose removal would collapse the entire system. And he knew it. Surviving the old world while building the new, Luciano's rise threatened the traditional bosses, especially Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, two men trapped in the past, battling each other like ancient kings while the world around them evolved. They ruled by force, demanded tribute, and refused innovation. Both men expected Luciano to follow their rules, but he understood a truth they could not grasp. There is no future for a king who refuses to change. He played them carefully, acting loyal, studying their weaknesses, observing their paranoia. Each believed they were using him. Each believed he was too young to challenge their authority. Luciano let them believe it, all while building his influence beneath their noses. Every handshake he offered hid a calculation. Every nod of respect concealed a plan. Every yes meant not yet. He knew he could not modernize the Mafia while these two relics still sat on their thrones. But he needed time, and allies, before making the most dangerous decision of his life. Loyalty redefined to Luciano, loyalty was not blind devotion, it was mutual benefit. He believed loyalty should flow from shared profit, not fear. Men followed him because their lives were better with him in power. He elevated people others ignored. He rewarded consistency. He forgave mistakes when they were honest. And he punished betrayal when it was deliberate. This approach made men fiercely loyal to him, not because they feared him but because they believed in him. They sensed he was building something lasting, something bigger than feuds and petty territorial wars. Luciano redefined loyalty as investment. And his followers invested deeply. The vision takes shape by the early 1930s. Luciano controlled so many alliances, networks, and revenue streams that the Mafia itself felt outdated to him. He envisioned an American underworld without monarchs, without clan-based stupidity, without endless cycles of revenge. A world where families cooperated instead of assassinated each other. A world run by logic and profit, not superstition and ego. This vision would later become the Commission. But even before its creation, the dream lived inside Luciano's mind like a blueprint waiting to be drawn. But every empire demands sacrifice. And every visionary faces a moment where the future requires blood. The looming question: Luciano had built an unstoppable network, multinational, multi-ethnic, multi-structured. But as his power grew, so did the danger. The old bosses were watching. Rivals were sharpening their knives. The very alliances he forged could collapse if he made one miscalculation. And looming ahead was the decision that would define everything. The decision that would determine whether his empire rose or fell, whether his brilliance became legend or disaster. What choice could risk everything he created? What move could elevate him to king, or bury him forever? The answer lay just over the horizon, waiting in a night that would demand courage, betrayal, and a mind sharper than any blade. Long before Lucky Luciano carved his place into the American underworld, the Mafia ran on a single immovable principle. Omerta, the ancient Sicilian code of silence. It was more than a rule. It was identity, religion, armor, and curse. Omerta demanded obedience, secrecy, loyalty unto death, and total rejection of government authority. A man who broke it did not simply betray his boss, he betrayed centuries of cultural survival. To the Sicilian mind, silence wasn't strategy. It was duty. And for a young Luciano growing up in the traditions of the old world, Omerta was one of the first lessons he absorbed. A whisper passed down through generations, warning that the world outside the family could never be trusted. But America was different. And the longer Luciano lived in it, the more he realized that blind devotion to old-world codes could doom the new world empire he hoped to build. The psychology behind the code: to understand Omerta is to understand fear. Not fear of violence but fear of vulnerability. Sicily's history was shaped by foreign invaders, corrupt rulers, and the necessity of silence for survival. The Mafia adopted omerta because secrecy protected them from enemies they could not openly fight. The psychology was simple: speak nothing. Trust only blood. Handle disputes internally. Never involve outside authority. In the fractured immigrant communities of New York, this rule hardened further. Italian immigrants had been mistreated, exploited, and viewed with suspicion, making omerta feel like the only way to preserve dignity and power. Breaking the code meant exile, humiliation, or death. Men followed it instinctively, sometimes without understanding why. For early Mafia bosses like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, omerta was not negotiable, it was the spine of their authority. If silence broke, so did their control. Luciano. Respecting the code, questioning its purpose as a child, Luciano absorbed omerta the same way he absorbed hunger and hardship. It was simply part of the world. But as he grew older, he began to question not the value of silence, but the way it was used. The old bosses clung to omerta as if it were holy scripture. They demanded absolute, unquestioning loyalty, even when their decisions were irrational or self-destructive. To them, silence meant obedience. To Luciano, silence was something more nuanced: a choice, not a burden; a tool, not a cage. He respected the principle: loyalty mattered. Secrecy mattered. Trust mattered. But he also saw the weakness in rigid tradition. The Mafia was changing. America was evolving. And omerta, in its purest form, could not survive modern pressures without adaptation. Old world obedience created brittle systems. New world pragmatism created flexible ones. Luciano wanted flexibility. Adapting the code for a new empire, Luciano's reinterpretation of omerta was subtle but radical. Where old bosses used silence to control men, he used silence to empower them. He believed men stayed loyal when they felt valued. Silence came naturally when a system benefited everyone. Obedience was stronger when earned, not forced. Luciano rewarded intelligence, initiative, and reliability. He did not demand robotic obedience. He allowed his men space to think, and that freedom created loyalty deeper than fear ever could. In his eyes, omerta should not be about submission to tradition. It should be about protecting the structure that allowed everyone to eat. But this modernization created tension. Many older bosses saw Luciano's flexibility as disrespect. Many younger gangsters embraced it as liberation. The rift between old and new grew wider with every year. Omerta as emotional discipline. One of Luciano's greatest psychological insights was understanding that silence wasn't just about secrets. It was about emotion. Anger caused mistakes. Pride fueled unnecessary wars. Fear triggered betrayals. Luciano taught his men to control their reactions. Think before you act. Watch before you strike. Speak only when necessary. Silence became a form of intelligence. A form of strength. Luciano rarely raised his voice. Rarely threatened. Rarely showed panic. This emotional silence made him unpredictable, and therefore powerful. Where Masuria relied on shouting and intimidation, Luciano relied on presence and control. Where Maranzano recited ancient codes, Luciano communicated with simple nods and quiet authority. He embodied a new kind of command: quiet, calculating, psychological. The weight of tradition. Yet even as he reshaped the meaning of omerta, Luciano felt the weight of the old world pressing against him. He had been raised to respect the code. It had kept his people alive. It had built the very structure he now hoped to modernize. To defy omerta openly would not just anger the bosses, it would violate something culturally sacred. It would make him a traitor in the eyes of men who judged betrayal more harshly than murder. This internal conflict shadowed every step he took toward leadership. How do you honor a tradition while breaking it? How do you modernize a system without destroying its identity? How do you move forward when the past demands your loyalty? Luciano walked that tightrope for years, balancing reverence and rebellion. Seeds of revolution as he built alliances across ethnic lines, streamlined operations, and created multinational partnerships. Luciano drifted further from the rigidity of the Sicilian mindset. He had entered a world where profit, not pride, determined success. But the old bosses refused to see the future. They clung to omerta not as strategy but as superstition. Luciano realized something dangerous. The old world would never allow the new world to exist. One would have to die for the other to live. The psychological and cultural tension reached its breaking point during the Castellamarese War. A conflict rooted not in business, but in old-world pride and ancient feuds. Every decision Luciano made during this war was shaped by his evolving relationship with omerta. He knew that to save the Mafia he might have to break the very code that defined it. He knew that silence could no longer be obedience, it had to become strategy. He knew that loyalty could no longer be blind, it had to be earned. And he knew that the night was coming when he would have to choose between tradition and transformation. A choice that would defy Omerta. A choice that would shock the old world. A choice that would forge the modern Mafia, and seal his destiny forever. Lucky Luciano did not inherit an empire. He built one piece by turning chaos into structure and crime into industry. Where earlier gangsters saw quick profits and endless turf fights, Luciano saw an opportunity to create something that could endure. He understood that violence made headlines but organization made kingdoms. And so he pioneered a system that transformed the American underworld into a corporate-style machine capable of generating predictable, unstoppable power. Luciano's genius was simple yet revolutionary. If crime behaved like a business, it could expand like one. Turning vice into industry before Luciano, illegal enterprises were messy, unreliable, and dangerously inconsistent. Gambling dens collapsed due to infighting. Prostitution rings imploded from greed. Union rackets fell apart because bosses treated them as personal piggy banks instead of systems. Luciano changed all of that. He believed every racket needed structure, defined roles, distribution channels, protection layers, and an administrative logic. He wanted operations to flow with the predictability of a legitimate corporation. So he built vertical systems, each with a hierarchy of responsibility. Managers for gambling operations trusted lieutenants to run prostitution networks, negotiators to handle labor unions, specialists for smuggling and distribution. The goal was simple. No part of the business should depend on one unstable man or one chaotic moment. Organization was safety. Organization was profit. Organization was power. And the more Luciano organized, the more he realized how fragile the old world truly was. The gambling empire, predictability over luck. Gambling was Luciano's favorite business because it was the easiest to regulate. With Meyer Lansky's mathematical genius guiding him, he turned gambling from a street hustle into a multi-city industry. They established standardized payouts, fixed protection rates, controlled cheating, and ran games with clockwork precision. No more unpredictable skimming. No more turf wars over dice games. No more reckless gunfights over petty disputes. Luciano wanted gamblers to feel safe because safety meant repeat customers, and repeat customers meant steady money. He treated each gambling location like a branch office. Every dollar was accounted for, every employee monitored, every risk minimized. His ability to create structure out of shadows made him more powerful than any brute with a gun. Prostitution. Efficiency wrapped in secrecy. Luciano's prostitution network showed his organizational brilliance most clearly. He created a city-wide system where madams operated under strict guidelines, collectors handled finances, enforcers protected the business quietly, and everyone answered to someone above them. The structure looked almost corporate. Workers, supervisors, controllers, regional heads, leadership at the top. Money flowed upward, protection flowed downward, and silence flowed everywhere. Omerta blended seamlessly with management efficiency. Luciano eliminated unpredictability, and unpredictability was the underworld's greatest enemy. But the tighter the system became, the more devastating any single disruption could be. One betrayal. One broken link. One reckless rival. That was all it would take to collapse the machine he had so carefully engineered. Union infiltration. Power without bullets. Labor racketeering was Luciano's quiet masterpiece. Instead of fighting union leaders, he became their partner. He inserted trusted men into key positions, controlled the flow of workers, and manipulated strikes and negotiations with surgical precision. A single phone call could shut down an entire pier, delay shipments for days, cripple a competitor's business, or earn enormous fees for labor peace. This was power without violence. Power without exposure. Power that came from organization rather than intimidation. Luciano understood that influence over unions gave him influence over entire industries. And industries were far more valuable than neighborhoods. A corporate mind in a criminal world. Luciano's operations flowed like a living organism. Each part fed another, each branch protected the rest. He did not rely on loyalty alone, he relied on design. His empire didn't need daily supervision. It ran itself because it had structure. But the deeper his roots sank, the more he noticed a growing vulnerability. A single reckless gangster could destabilize everything. Because organization, for all its strengths, is brittle. A system that depends on silence collapses when someone talks. A hierarchy that depends on order crumbles when someone challenges it. A business model that depends on cooperation shatters when one man acts alone. Luciano understood this painfully well. The threat of the unpredictable. Every empire has an Achilles heel. Luciano's was the uncontrollable element, the gangster who rejected logic, ignored strategy, and acted out of impulse rather than profit. Men who treated prohibition like a personal war instead of an opportunity. Men who valued fame over safety, rage over reason. Dutch Schultz was the embodiment of this danger. Wild, unpredictable, and dangerously ambitious, Schultz represented everything Luciano's empire was built to resist. While Luciano used diplomacy to expand influence, Schultz used brute terror. While Luciano structured his businesses for longevity, Schultz threatened to blow everything up with a single rash decision. And it was one decision in particular, one violent, impulsive, catastrophic desire, that threatened to dismantle the entire underworld. His obsession with assassinating prosecutor Thomas Dewey was more than reckless. It was suicidal. It was the kind of disruption Luciano feared most. A lone wolf jeopardizing years of structure, stability, and careful diplomacy. Luciano knew this truth with chilling clarity. A single act of chaos could bring down an entire empire of order. The tension that built the future. As Luciano's power grew, so did the fragility of the empire beneath him. Every new system he built increased efficiency but also raised the stakes. The balance between order and collapse became razor-thin. The more sophisticated the business became, the more catastrophic a single betrayal or miscalculation could be. Luciano could predict many things: fear, loyalty, ambition, but he could not predict the hearts of men who refused to think. This tension shaped his rise. It shaped his decisions. And it shaped the night that would redefine everything. The empire he built was brilliant, profitable, and unprecedented. But it was also fragile. And he knew, long before that fateful night arrived, that the greatest threat to a perfectly organized world was not the enemy outside. It was the unpredictable force within. Lucky Luciano stood at the center of a rapidly evolving criminal world, a world he hoped to modernize, streamline, and control with intelligence rather than brute force. But every step he took toward transformation was shadowed by the men orbiting him. Some saw his brilliance, some feared it, some wanted to use it, and some wanted to destroy it. Each man in Luciano's orbit sharpened the stakes. Each enemy narrowed his choices. Each ally carried the potential to become a threat. And in this tightening circle, Luciano learned a truth he would never escape. Power is not only what you build, it is what you survive. Joe Masuria, the tyrant blocking the future before Luciano could reshape the Mafia, he had to navigate the suffocating rule of Joe, the boss Masuria, a relic who treated New York as his personal kingdom. Masuria ruled through intimidation, superstition, and crude simplicity. He didn't negotiate, he demanded. He didn't modernize, he resisted. He didn't plan, he reacted. And worst of all, he believed loyalty was something he owned. To Masuria, Luciano was a talented young soldier, useful but not dangerous. He saw in Luciano a clever mind that could make him richer, but not a mind that could challenge him. That mistake would eventually cost Masuria everything. Under Masuria, Luciano felt trapped in an era that refused to end. The old boss dismissed alliances with Jews or Irish gangs as blasphemy. He saw prohibition profits as trophies rather than strategic fuel. He refused to adapt because he believed tradition was invincible. Luciano knew better. Every time Masuria barked orders, every time he sabotaged alliances, every time he started unnecessary wars, Luciano felt the future being strangled by the past. Remaining loyal to Masuria meant remaining loyal to chaos. And chaos had no place in the empire Luciano envisioned. But Masuria was not a man one simply walked away from. To leave him alive meant inviting a death sentence. To stay meant killing the future. Luciano was trapped, until an unexpected rival appeared. Salvatore Maranzano, the ambitious strategist Salvatore Maranzano, the Castellammarese boss who arrived from Sicily with dreams of grandeur, was the opposite of Masuria in almost every way. He was educated, calculating, and strategic. He saw structure where Masuria saw violence. He saw opportunity where Masuria saw threat. And he saw Luciano as a useful weapon in his war for supremacy. Where Masuria wanted blind loyalty, Maranzano wanted disciplined obedience. He fancied himself a Roman emperor, a Machiavellian architect destined to rule all Italian crime in America. He admired Luciano's intelligence, but only in the way a king admires a sword, useful, powerful, but never equal. At first, Luciano believed Maranzano might be the leader capable of modernizing the Mafia. But the more he learned, the more he realized Maranzano was simply a different kind of tyrant. One used bullets. The other used strategy. But both demanded absolute control. Maranzano praised Luciano's vision while quietly plotting to eliminate him once he became too influential. Luciano read the signs, the drawn-out silences, the changing tone, the sudden orders designed to test loyalty. Maranzano wanted to replace Mafia, not the system that kept men like Mafia in power. Luciano understood that one dictator would simply replace another. He was no longer fighting for a boss. He was fighting for a future. And Maranzano had no place in it. Dutch Schultz, the wild card ready to burn the empire while Mafia and Maranzano represented the old world, Dutch Schultz represented something equally dangerous: unpredictability. Schultz was brilliant in bursts, violent in habits, unstable in mind. He ran his bootlegging empire like a storm, striking aggressively, impulsively, and without regard for consequences. Luciano tolerated Schultz only because he was profitable. But the profits came with risk. Schultz's paranoia led to unnecessary killings. His ego ignited senseless turf wars. His temper escalated small disputes into bloodshed. Luciano saw him as a hazard, a man who could destroy carefully built alliances with a single bad decision. And then came the worst decision of all. Schultz wanted to assassinate prosecutor Thomas Dewey. To Schultz, Dewey was a threat that needed elimination. To Luciano, killing a prosecutor was a suicide note written in blood. Such a hit would trigger war with the government, a war no amount of money, muscle, or alliances could survive. It was the kind of reckless impulse that could collapse the entire criminal world. Schultz didn't understand structure. He didn't care about long-term consequences. All he saw was revenge. Luciano saw something else. The greatest danger to his empire was not the old bosses, it was unpredictability. And unpredictability had to be removed. Vito Genovese. The patient shadow of Schultz posed an immediate threat, Vito Genovese posed a quieter, deeper one. Genovese was ambitious, cunning, and unburdened by conscience. He admired Luciano, learned from him, obeyed him, but only until the moment he could replace him. Unlike Schultz, Genovese did not act on impulse. He acted with cold patience. He positioned himself as Luciano's loyal lieutenant, yet always stayed close to the power he wanted to inherit. His loyalty had weight, but it also had an expiration date. Luciano understood Genovese's psychology. He was the kind of man who would wait years to strike, the kind who would betray without hesitation if the timing benefited him. To keep Genovese close was to keep an enemy within reach. To push him away was to provoke him. Luciano had no choice but to watch him carefully. In a world where loyalty was rare, Genovese represented the most dangerous kind of ally, one who believed he should rule. The circle tightened as Luciano built alliances with Lansky, Siegel, and international partners. The world around him constricted. Mafia resisted modernization. Maranzano sought dictatorship. Schultz threatened the government. Genovese waited in the shadows. Every move Luciano made required precision. Every alliance carried weight. Every enemy narrowed his options. To move too soon meant death. To move too late meant destruction. To stay still meant surrender. He stood at the center of forces that wanted him loyal, obedient, or dead, but never equal. And yet, Luciano's mind sharpened under pressure. He realized that survival was no longer enough. He needed to reshape the entire power structure before the power structure destroyed him. The night he would make his most dangerous decision was approaching. A night when allies, enemies, ambition, and fate would converge. A night when Luciano would stop reacting to forces around him and begin shaping the world in his own design. The Castellamarese War was not a war in the traditional sense. It was a pressure cooker of whispered threats, hidden alliances, quiet betrayals, and sudden bursts of violence that sent shockwaves through New York's underworld. On the surface, it was a struggle between Joe Mafia and Salvatore Maranzano for dominance. But beneath that surface lay something far more dangerous. A war of psychology, a battle for the future, and a test of whether Lucky Luciano could navigate forces that would crush lesser men. The streets buzzed with rumors. Cafés brimmed with spies. Every handshake carried a blade. Every silence carried a message. Luciano stood in the center of it all, a man forced into a chess game where every piece was alive and armed. The war no one chose, but everyone was dragged into the conflict began slowly, with petty territorial disputes that grew into assassinations. Mafia's men ambushed Maranzano's soldiers. Maranzano's loyalists retaliated with ambushes of their own. Blood-stained sidewalks. Bodies surfaced in alleys. Every killing deepened the feud, but neither side could claim a decisive victory. Both bosses demanded loyalty. Both bosses demanded total obedience. Both bosses believed they alone deserved the throne. Luciano, caught between the two, knew the truth neither tyrant wanted to face. This war was destroying the Mafia. Prohibition profits were slipping. Alliances were fracturing. Politicians were panicking. Law enforcement was circling like sharks. The old world feud had evolved into a crisis capable of swallowing the entire underworld. And Luciano understood something the old bosses didn't. America was not Sicily. Endless vendettas would not be tolerated. New York's criminal empire needed structure, not slaughter. But structure required vision. Slaughter required none. And slaughter was winning. Living between assassins and expectations every day of the war placed Luciano in mortal danger. If he appeared too loyal to Masuria, Maranzano's men marked him for death. If he showed favor to Maranzano, Masuria would interpret it as betrayal. Luciano's survival depended on a balancing act so precise that one misplaced word could end his life. He developed a habit of reading rooms before entering them, noting who arrived early, who avoided eye contact, who whispered too quietly. He memorized escape routes in restaurants, bars, and meeting halls. He traveled with different drivers, different cars, different patterns. He never sat with his back to the door. The war taught him a truth that would shape the rest of his life. Silence was not just protection, it was strategy. Speak too much and you exposed your intentions. Speak too little and others filled the silence with their fears. Luciano became a master of calculated ambiguity. The psychological chessboard behind the violence, an invisible chess match unfolded. Maranzano sent envoys with subtle threats disguised as offers. Masuria demanded tributes disguised as tests of loyalty. Spies infiltrated both sides, some switching allegiances multiple times. Informants fed rumors into the streets, hoping fear alone would weaken the rivals. Luciano studied every move. Who approached him and why? Who stayed silent and for how long? Who waited for orders and who acted independently? He began to see patterns, weaknesses, blind spots, ambitions. The war was not just physical, it was psychological. And psychology was Luciano's battlefield. He noticed how Maranzano treated men like pawns, disposable, replaceable. He noticed how Masuria relied on fear, blunt and unsophisticated. Both leaders misunderstood the world around them. Both were fighting a Sicilian war on American soil. And both were losing. Luciano began imagining something radical, a mafia without monarchs. A system without tyrants. A structure that prevented wars rather than caused them. But to build the future, the past had to burn. An unspoken alliance quietly, secretly, dangerously, Luciano began meeting with neutral figures. Men tired of the war, men losing money, men who wanted stability. They didn't call it rebellion. They didn't call it conspiracy. They called it survival. Behind closed doors, the first seeds of what would become the Commission were planted. Whispered discussions about cooperation, fairness, and collective leadership. But there was a problem. Neither Masuria nor Maranzano would ever agree to such a system. Both believed they deserved absolute power. Both viewed compromise as weakness. Both saw Luciano as a resource, not a leader. Luciano knew what that meant. This war would not end with negotiation. It would end with death. But whose death would define the future? Assassins in every shadow. The deeper Luciano became involved in the political side of the war, the more his life hung by a thread. Maranzano sent subtle feelers, hints that Luciano could rise if he betrayed Masuria. Masuria, paranoid and slipping, began suspecting everyone including Luciano. And then the attempts began. A car bomb that misfired. A knife attack in an alley intercepted by chance. A gunman waiting in a stairwell who hesitated at the wrong moment. Each survival felt less like luck and more like warning. Luciano could not navigate this war forever. Eventually one assassin would not miss. A city on the edge. By 1930, New York was suffocating under the weight of the war. Families split. Alliances crumbled. Territory changed hands weekly. Businesses collapsed. Even corrupt politicians, usually happy to accept mafia money, grew nervous. The underworld was losing control. The government was gaining interest. And public scrutiny threatened to expose everything. Luciano realized that if the mafia didn't end the war soon, the government would end it for them, with mass arrests and political crackdowns. The future he envisioned would become impossible. It was time for a decision no man had ever dared to make. The breaking point. The pressure reached its peak on a night Luciano would never forget. A night when the war's logic became unbearable, when survival instinct collided with destiny, when the only options were violence or annihilation. He understood that the war was not truly between Masuria and Maranzano. It was a war between the past and the future. Between old world tyranny and new world structure. Between chaos and order. between survival and extinction. And Luciano stood alone in the middle. If he chose wrong, he would die. If he chose nothing, the Mafia would die. If he chose correctly, he would change history. One decision. One night. One irreversible path. The hidden war had reached its final tension, and Luciano was the only man who could bring it to an end. History remembers the night simply as the moment everything changed. But for Lucky Luciano, it was far more personal. It was the night he stepped beyond loyalty, beyond tradition, beyond the boundaries of the world that raised him. It was the night he gambled his future, his life, and the very soul of the Mafia, all on a single irreversible decision. The evening air hung heavy over New York, thick with cigarette smoke and the static of a city that felt on the brink of something. Luciano had spent the entire day in motion. Meetings, coded conversations, subtle glances passed between allies who knew too much. But as night fell, he found himself alone for a moment, staring at the skyline he hoped to reshape. This was the night he would break the old world. Or die trying. The moment of no return. Joe Masuria had ruled through fear, superstition, and brute inefficiency. His refusal to modernize had turned opportunity into chaos. Luciano had served him loyally, even admired his ferocity at one point, but the Prohibition Empire was collapsing under Masuria's stubbornness. Luciano realized that if he didn't act, they would all fall, either to Maranzano, to law enforcement, or to internal implosion. For weeks, Luciano had weighed the unthinkable, betraying the man he had sworn allegiance to. Omerta demanded loyalty. Tradition demanded obedience. But the future demanded action. Tonight was the night that calculation would become blood. Inside a small Coney Island restaurant, Masuria sat at a table playing cards, unaware that his fate was sealed. Luciano had stepped out moments earlier, his expression unreadable, his silence carrying the weight of a death sentence. It was the last time the two men would occupy the same room. As Luciano walked down the steps, he felt the gravity of what was about to happen. Not fear of death, but fear of becoming the kind of man who would sacrifice one life for the survival of many. But the decision had already been made. The pieces were already in motion. There was no turning back. The gunmen arrived. The quiet outside shattered as the assassins, Albert Anastasia, Bugsy Siegel, Vito Genovese, and Joe Adonis, stormed the restaurant. They moved with practiced precision, weapons drawn, loyalty to Luciano guiding their hands. Masuria barely had time to rise from his chair before the bullets rained down, cutting through the old boss's reign with brutal finality. The shots echoed through the walls, through the kitchen, through the night, each one a symbolic end to the past. When the smoke cleared, the tyrant who had clung to power through fear lay lifeless across a table of fallen playing cards. Luciano did not witness the killing, but he felt each shot as if it were fired inside him. This was not victory. This was transformation. This was the price of evolution. The birth of a new order, and the rise of another tyrant. With Masuria gone, Luciano expected relief. Instead, he walked into a second storm, Salvatore Maranzano. The supposed ally who helped orchestrate Masuria's downfall revealed himself as something equally dangerous. A man who dreamed of becoming Capo di Tutti Capi, the boss of all bosses. It was the same crown Masuria had worn. The same crown Luciano rejected. A crown that suffocated innovation and bred endless wars. Maranzano reorganized the Mafia into families, which Luciano supported, but then demanded tribute, obedience, and total control, which Luciano did not. Within weeks, Luciano realized he had traded one dictator for another, a more polished dictator but no less deadly. And Maranzano? He sensed Luciano's rising influence. He began plotting to eliminate him. He hired hitmen. He prepared lists of men to be killed. Luciano's name was at the top. Luciano had killed the old king only to stand in the sights of the new one. Once again he faced the same impossible choice: kill or be killed. Defy tradition or die for it. Rewrite the Mafia or watch it collapse under its own arrogance. The night of the double revolution, the nights leading up to Maranzano's assassination, were soaked in paranoia. Luciano altered routines, avoided familiar restaurants, held meetings in unpredictable locations. Even trusted allies spoke in hushed tones. Every sound became threat. Every shadow became possibility. Finally, Luciano reached the same conclusion he had with Masuria. The future could not be built on old world thrones. So he made the most dangerous decision of his life. He ordered the assassination of another boss of bosses. This time, the killers entered disguised as IRS agents, walking straight into Maranzano's office. In seconds, the facade of legitimacy shattered. Maranzano's ambition died with him, stabbed and shot by men who carried Luciano's vision into the room. The old world was dead. The feudal mafia died with him. A new era began in the spray of gunfire. The psychological weight of the choice: killing a rival was one thing. Killing a boss was another. But killing two bosses, breaking omerta twice, meant Luciano was rewriting not just rules but identity. He knew the consequences. He knew the moral cost. He knew that history would remember him as both a visionary and a traitor. But he also knew something more profound. If he had not acted, the mafia would have destroyed itself. His decisions were not born from ambition alone. They were born from necessity, from the recognition that survival required evolution, and evolution required sacrifice. Luciano had gambled everything: his alliances, his survival, his soul. The modern mafia is born in the aftermath. Luciano abolished the title boss of all bosses. He created the commission, a governing body that distributed power, resolved disputes, and prevented tyrants from rising again. It was unprecedented, a criminal democracy rooted in logic rather than legacy. The American mafia, as history knows it, began on the night Luciano broke the old order. The blood spilled that night was not only the end of feuds, it was the birth of structure, the birth of cooperation, the birth of an empire designed to outlive its creator. The night that defined him. When Luciano looked back on his life, this was the night that echoed most loudly, not because of the violence but because of the weight of the choice. He stepped into darkness willingly so that others could operate in the light of order. It was the night that made him king. And the night that began the long shadow that would one day consume him. When the smoke of the Castellamarese War finally cleared, Lucky Luciano stood in the ruins of an old world, a world he had dismantled with strategy, courage, and the cold acceptance that evolution demands sacrifice. Two kings had fallen. Centuries-old traditions had been shattered. The mafia, long trapped under the weight of tyrants and superstition, was suddenly without a ruler. And that was exactly how Luciano wanted it. He did not seek a throne. He sought a system. A future where no man could tyrannize the underworld the way Masuria and Maranzano had. A future where structure, cooperation, and logic replaced paranoia and vendettas. A future where the mafia survived not by accident, but by design. To create that future, Luciano had to rebuild the underworld from the ground up. He needed to replace monarchy with governance, chaos with coordination, violence with rules. He needed the commission. The vision, a council instead of a king. Luciano understood something none of his predecessors ever did. Power is more stable when shared. The mafia's greatest weakness had always been its own leaders. Bosses fought for territory, pride, and titles that brought more danger than benefit. Wars erupted over insults. Families were destroyed by the ego of one man. Luciano had watched the consequences firsthand: bodies in the streets, money lost, opportunities wasted. So he proposed something audacious: a governing council of equals. Not one supreme boss. Not one tyrant. A board of directors for the criminal world. In this vision, every major family had representation. Disputes were settled through discussion, not bloodshed. Expansion was planned, not stolen. Profits were protected, not gambled away by unstable men. It was the end of feudalism and the dawn of organization. Constructing the new mafia. At the first commission meeting, the leaders of New York's 5 families arrived, wary but curious. They were joined, or would later be joined, by representatives from Chicago, Buffalo, Cleveland, Detroit, Los Angeles, and other cities with strong mafia presence. Luciano laid out his plan with clarity and calm. 1. Each family would maintain its independence. No forced subordination. No dictated tribute. 2. All major decisions required commission approval. Assassinations, expansions, disputes, nothing unilateral. 3. There would be no boss of bosses. The title died with Maranzano. 4. Violence would be regulated. No rogue killings. No unnecessary wars. 5. Cooperation across state lines became the new standard. Bootlegging, gambling, narcotics, unions, everything interconnected. The bosses listened. Some nodded. Some frowned. But all of them recognized genius when they heard it. The system was too profitable, too logical, too stabilizing to reject. Luciano had solved the mafia's greatest weakness by turning it into its greatest strength. A national criminal network emerges with the commission established. The mafia transformed almost overnight. Gambling operations in New York coordinated with bookmakers in Chicago. Labor racketeering routes worked in tandem from coast to coast. Prohibition-era smuggling evolved into national distribution networks. Territory disputes shrank as negotiation replaced violence. Money flowed like never before. Violence dropped dramatically. Law enforcement struggled to understand how the once chaotic mafia had suddenly become disciplined. This was Luciano's brilliance, a mind capable of seeing the underworld not as scattered clans but as one organism. The underworld becomes a business. Luciano and his closest allies, Lansky, Siegel, Costello, refined the system further. They applied business principles to criminal enterprises. Standardized payments, centralized decision-making, clear operational hierarchies, investment in profitable ventures, reduced exposure to violence. The mafia functioned almost like a corporation, predictable, stable, and coordinated. For the first time, it wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. And every boss knew who to thank for that stability. Luciano's rising influence, admired, feared, unavoidable. Even though Luciano refused the title boss of bosses, most men quietly saw him as the architect of the new world. They sought his guidance, respected his insights, and hesitated to oppose him. He didn't rule them, but his vision ruled the system, and that made him the most influential man in American organized crime. His power came from intelligence, not intimidation, diplomacy, not dictatorship strategy, not superstition. The underworld had never seen a leader like him. But with visibility came danger. The government begins to notice. For decades, law enforcement saw mafia crime as isolated, scattered gangs, petty criminals, ethnic feuds. But suddenly territories were calm. Profits skyrocketed. Cities experienced synchronized criminal activity. And the same names appeared in investigative reports across multiple states. The FBI didn't yet understand the commission, but they understood something was different. Luciano's name came up again and again, in gambling investigations and prostitution cases, in bootlegging files and union corruption reports. He had become impossible to ignore. What the mafia saw as stability, the government saw as organization, and organization meant danger on a national scale. Thomas Dewey takes aim. Among those watching Luciano closely was Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey, a man determined to dismantle organized crime through relentless investigation and public pressure. To Dewey, Luciano was the center of the storm, the quiet mastermind, the architect of a criminal network more unified than anything America had witnessed. Luciano represented intelligence, coordination, and power, the exact qualities the government had never been able to defeat. The creation of the commission had made Luciano stronger, but it had also made him a target. Victory with a shadow. As Luciano watched his new system take shape, pride filled him, but so did unease. The old world was gone. The future he envisioned had arrived. The mafia was stable, profitable, and organized. But the price of that victory was exposure. No longer could Luciano hide behind chaos. No longer was he one boss among many. He had become the man who rebuilt the underworld, and the government wanted him removed. The moment the crown became a weight, on the night the commission was formally cemented, Luciano celebrated quietly with his closest allies. Glasses clinked. Cigarette smoke curled through the air. Men spoke of the future with rare optimism. But Luciano felt something else, the faint beginning of a storm. He knew he had changed the mafia forever. He also knew the world outside would now come for him harder than ever. His masterpiece had become his legacy, and his greatest vulnerability. The night Lucky Luciano created the commission should have been the beginning of a long reign, the victory lap after a revolution. For a moment it was. The mafia had stability, vision, and unprecedented unity. The bosses were satisfied. The streets were calm. The money flowed without interruption. Luciano had reshaped the criminal world in a way no man before him had dared. But every revolution carries a cost. And the decision that built the modern mafia also began the slow, inevitable unmaking of its architect. In the shadows of celebration, a new enemy had already taken notice. Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey, a man with none of the old world constraints, none of the fear that held others back, and none of the vulnerabilities Luciano's psychology could manipulate. Dewey did not care about tradition. He cared about results. And he wanted Luciano's head. A new kind of hunter. Dewey was unlike any prosecutor the mafia had ever faced. He didn't see gangsters as street thugs, he saw them as corporate executives of an illegal empire. He didn't chase petty crimes, he studied patterns. He connected dots other investigators ignored. And he understood something crucial. If the mafia now functioned like a business, then the man running it was a businessman, one who could be dismantled like any CEO. Dewey watched Luciano's alliances, his movements, his associates, and his revenue streams. He spoke to informants in whispers. He pressured frightened madams. He used financial records like weapons. He studied the logic Luciano had built, not to admire it but to tear it apart. For every step forward Luciano had taken, Dewey was already identifying the crack beneath it. Luciano's revolution had made the Mafia safer. But it had made him visible. And visibility is fatal. Cracks inside the empire. Luciano had always known the greatest danger came from unpredictability, the Dutch Schulzes of the world who acted before thinking. But as pressure mounted, a new kind of threat began to grow: silent ambition, hidden resentment, private fear. The very structure Luciano built created order, but it also created envy. Some bosses resented his influence. Some feared the power he quietly accumulated. Some questioned whether any man should have such sway over a national criminal network. And within Luciano's own circle, a darker threat simmered: Vito Genovese, a man whose loyalty was conditional, whose ambition was limitless, and whose patience was chilling. Genovese watched the rising tension between Dewey and Luciano with a strategist's eye. He understood that the stronger Dewey's case became, the weaker Luciano's position grew. And in that weakness, Genovese saw opportunity. The fall of a king always creates room for another. The case that shouldn't have been possible. Luciano had built his prostitution system with layers of protection. Madams insulated from leadership, employees unaware of the structure, collectors operating in shadows. It was designed for secrecy. But Dewey didn't need the truth. He needed witnesses. He needed someone scared enough to talk. And fear is a language Dewey spoke fluently. One by one, women from the prostitution rings were arrested. Some were immigrants. Some were desperate. Some had children. Dewey offered deals: testify or face ruin. He turned the emotional weight of survival against Luciano's once airtight system. They began to talk. Not accurately. Not consistently. But enough to build a narrative. The narrative that Lucky Luciano was the mastermind behind a sprawling prostitution empire. Luciano listened as rumors of testimony spread. The logic of the case made no sense. He never managed brothels personally, never met most of the witnesses, never touched the day-to-day operations. But Dewey wasn't pursuing truth. He was pursuing Luciano. And in the court of public opinion, Luciano's brilliance became suspicious. His structure became evidence. His organizational genius became proof of guilt. Allies began to waver as the case tightened. Luciano's inner circle grew uneasy. Men whispered in corners, worried about indictments, worried about futures, worried about surviving in a city where Dewey's shadow stretched over everything. Some distanced themselves quietly. Some stopped returning calls. Some considered cooperation. Luciano could feel the shift, not betrayal yet but fear. And fear, once seated, grows quickly. He tried to steady the foundation. He held meetings. He reassured allies. He reminded them of the prophets, the stability, the necessity of unity. But even as he spoke, he sensed the truth. The empire he built was still strong. But the men inside it were beginning to fracture. And fractures become collapse. The media turns the spotlight. Newspapers loved Dewey. They loved his clean-cut image, his relentless crusade, his promise to rid New York of vice. Every headline painted Luciano as a criminal mastermind, the underworld CEO, the most dangerous man in America. Ironically, the media described him exactly as he had built himself. But in public perception, brilliance became threat. He was no longer invisible. He was no longer safe. Luciano understood psychology better than anyone, and he recognized the shift immediately. Once the public sees a man as a villain, the courts become eager to confirm their belief. This was no longer a legal battle. It was a political one. And politics rarely offers mercy. The net tightens as Dewey built his case. Luciano faced a dilemma no strategy could solve. If he fled, he looked guilty. If he fought, he legitimized the accusations. If he stayed silent, he relied on a system designed to crush him. Behind him, Genovese watched. In him, the bosses whispered. Around him, the government closed ranks. The man who once navigated a hidden war now faced a public one, a battle he could not win with alliances or silence. The revolution had built the Mafia into a national power. Now that same revolution made Luciano the nation's top target. The fall begins. Luciano was finally arrested. A moment that felt less like surprise and more like inevitability. Dewey stood triumphant, armed with witnesses, headlines, and political momentum. The trial that followed was not about guilt or innocence. It was about symbolism. Luciano had modernized the Mafia. Now the government wanted to modernize how it dealt with him. Witness after witness testified, weaving stories, half-truths, and rehearsed lines. Luciano remained calm, dignified, silent. But silence, once his greatest weapon, had become a liability. When the verdict came, it echoed through the underworld: Lucky Luciano, guilty. sentenced to decades behind bars. The architect of the modern mafia was removed from the empire he built. The fall had begun, not with a bullet, but with the consequences of a revolution that had made him too powerful to ignore. The courtroom was everything Lucky Luciano had spent his life avoiding: exposed, loud, merciless. For a man who built his empire in shadows, through whispers, silence, and psychological finesse, standing under glaring lights felt like a different kind of execution. The king of secrecy was being forced into the open, and the world came to watch. Reporters packed every bench. Flashbulbs cracked like gunfire. Headlines had already cast Luciano as the mastermind of modern vice, long before a single witness testified. The man entering the courtroom that morning was not Salvatore Lucania, the quiet, calculating strategist, but Lucky Luciano, the symbol prosecutors needed to destroy. Dewey's narrative, a new kind of villain. Thomas E. Dewey approached the trial like a military campaign. He didn't accuse Luciano of being a common gangster. He accused him of running an empire. He painted a picture of a man pulling strings in the shadows, orchestrating illegal industries with corporate precision. To Dewey, Luciano wasn't a criminal, he was the CEO of crime itself. Prostitution rings became departments. Collectors became managers. Luciano became the chairman of vice. It didn't matter that Luciano had never personally overseen the brothels. What mattered was the image. Dewey knew juries feared structure more than violence. And Luciano's genius, the efficiency he brought to the underworld, now appeared to them as monstrous. Witnesses, many terrified, some coached, told stories Dewey wanted to hear. Inconsistencies didn't matter. Fear shaped their testimony. Dewey shaped the fear. Luciano sat through it all in silence, aware of the bitter irony. He was being punished for the brilliance that built his empire. A king forced into visibility. Luciano's calmness unsettled the courtroom. When he sat still, they called him cold. When he looked forward, they called him calculating. When he avoided eye contact, they claimed he was hiding guilt. Silence had always been his greatest tool. Now it became his enemy. He felt the weight of eyes studying him, interpreting his gestures, stripping away the mystery he had spent a lifetime cultivating. This was not the world of coded glances and quiet meetings. This was a stage, and he had become its unwilling actor. He could no longer control the narrative. He could only endure it. Voices that should have stayed silent. Some of the most painful betrayals came from men who claimed to know him. Fringe associates who embellished their roles, opportunists who traded loyalty for leniency, frightened witnesses who invoked Luciano's name simply because it protected them from Dewey's wrath. Luciano didn't flinch. But inside, each lie cut deep. He had always known loyalty was fragile. But hearing his own world twisted against him was a new kind of violence. Omerta, the code that had once held the underworld together, crumbled on the stand. Dewey hadn't just built a case, he had shattered a culture. The media's courtroom outside the courthouse, newspapers turned the trial into theater. They demonized Luciano with enthusiasm, sketching him as a puppet master whose influence infected every corner of New York. Handsome, quiet, composed, the press twisted these traits into proof of manipulation. He had once survived because he was invisible. Now visibility was killing him. The defense outmatched Luciano's lawyers, presented logical arguments. He never met most of the witnesses. He didn't personally run prostitution houses. The evidence was circumstantial. The stories were inconsistent. But none of it mattered. The jury wasn't judging facts. They were judging the image crafted around him, the idea that one man could be the architect of a new criminal era. Luciano realized something chilling. He wasn't losing to Dewey's evidence. He was losing to Dewey's story. The verdict, a symbol falls when the verdict was announced, guilty. The courtroom exhaled as if victory had been pre-written. Dewey stood triumphant. Reporters scribbled furiously. The public celebrated. Luciano simply nodded. There was no outburst. No denial. No plea. He accepted the moment with the same quiet strength that once built his empire, but this time silence offered no protection. The judge sentenced him to decades in prison. A punishment meant not just to incarcerate a man, but to send a message. America will not tolerate a criminal mastermind. The psychological weight of the moment as guards clasped chains around his wrists, Luciano understood the symbolism. The night he reshaped the Mafia, the night he eliminated tyrants and built the commission, had brought him here. He had created a system strong enough to survive. But in doing so, he had revealed himself to the world. The king of shadows had been dragged into the light. And light was unforgiving. Walking out of the courtroom, flashbulbs exploding around him, Luciano felt something he had rarely encountered: exposure. Not fear. Not regret. Exposure. Because he knew the trial wasn't just about prostitution. It was about the government confronting the structure he built. They weren't sentencing Luciano the man. They were sentencing Luciano the architect. A king reduced but not defeated, yet even as he was led away, there was a spark in his expression. Quiet, controlled, dangerous. Because Luciano understood something deeper than Dewey's courtroom drama. You can imprison a body. You cannot imprison an idea. The commission would continue. His system would survive. His influence would echo. But for now, the king who once ruled the underworld through silence and strategy faced a new reality. The price of revolution was being forced into the light. Prison did not break Lucky Luciano. It confined him, but it did not quiet the mind that once rebuilt the American underworld. Iron bars could limit his movements but not his influence. His empire had been constructed from relationships, psychology, and structure, all things that could survive beyond walls. And so, even from a cell, Luciano remained a force. But power without freedom is a different kind of burden. A quieter one. A heavier one. A strategist in captivity. Upon entering Clinton Correctional Facility, Luciano did what he had always done in unfamiliar territory. He observed. He mapped routines. He studied guards. He identified which inmates commanded respect and which ones hid behind bravado. The hierarchy of prison was no different from the hierarchy of the streets. Desperate men trying to carve out control where little existed. Luciano adapted quickly. Not by intimidation. Not by alliances of fear. But by commanding quiet authority. He listened more than he spoke. He solved disputes before they became violence. He gave advice that kept men alive. Soon, inmates came to him not as a boss but as a strategist. Someone whose mind could turn chaos into clarity. Even some guards, annoyed by endless conflicts, saw value in Luciano's presence. A few subtle nods, a few avoided fights. He became the unofficial stabilizer of the prison's tension. He remained a prisoner. But psychologically he was still a leader. Influence that survived the walls outside the prison. The Mafia continued operating, and they still looked to Luciano. His lieutenants, especially Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello, visited when they could, slipping updates into casual conversation, extracting direction from the smallest gestures. Luciano never issued explicit orders. He didn't need to. His men had learned his logic so well that a single question, a raised eyebrow, or a brief comment could shape decisions across cities. The commission continued. Operations continued. His blueprint remained alive. But something else grew as quietly as his influence: distance. Every year behind bars, the world he built shifted slightly. Men aged. Alliances changed. Younger gangsters rose with different ambitions. The empire still followed his rules, but it no longer depended on him the way it once did. That was the beginning of a new kind of pain, the pain of watching relevance fade. Psychological confinement. Physically, Luciano was confined to a cell. Emotionally, he was confined to memories. He spent long nights replaying the choices that led him here. The night Masuria died. The day Maranzano fell. The creation of the commission. The decision that transformed the Mafia and exposed him to the world. In the underworld, brilliance was power. In prison, brilliance was torment. He understood the irony too well. The very structure that made him untouchable in the streets made him traceable in the courts. He had modernized the Mafia, and modernization made him visible. At times, he wondered whether the price had been worth it. Respect without reign within prison walls. Luciano gained a different kind of respect. Not fear. Not obedience. Respect. Men admired the calm way he handled despair, the discipline he carried into every hour, the dignity he maintained even when newspapers mocked him. He had been a king outside, now he was simply a man inside. But even that simplicity commanded attention. Yet respect is not reign. Respect is not power. Respect does not give back what was taken. Every time he heard a distant radio reporting on New York crime, every time a visitor mentioned a shift in the commission, every time he realized decisions were being made without him, he felt another piece of his old life drift away. He was still influential. But he was no longer essential. The empire evolves without him. Years passed. The Mafia changed. New leaders emerged, some brilliant, some reckless, some hungry for a legacy of their own. Luciano's fingerprints were still everywhere, but the underworld was evolving beyond their shape. He watched from afar as the empire stabilized, expanded, diversified. He watched as men who once followed his every word now followed their own instincts. He watched as younger generations spoke his name with admiration, but not dependence. The world he built was thriving. But it was thriving without him. This was the consequence he had not anticipated, not prison, not isolation, not fear. But irrelevance. The weight of his decision the night he reshaped the Mafia, he had believed the cost would be blood. He never understood that the true cost would be time, the slow unraveling of belonging, the erosion of influence, the quiet fading from a world he once dominated. Lucky Luciano had changed the Mafia forever. And now the Mafia, in its evolution, was slowly changing beyond him. He still held influence. He still commanded respect. He still shaped events in subtle ways. But behind bars he faced the truth of every great architect. Once the structure stands, it no longer needs the builder. And that was the heaviest sentence of all. When Lucky Luciano was deported to Italy in 1946, he stepped onto the docks of Naples as a man severed from the world he built. America had been his kingdom, the place where his mind shaped an empire. Italy was a birthplace, not a home, and certainly not a throne. Exile was more than distance. It was dislocation, the slow unraveling of a man whose power had always depended on proximity. Italy greeted him with curiosity and suspicion. Men whispered his name, but whispers are not allegiance. He tried to reinsert himself into the Sicilian and Neapolitan underworld, but here crime operated by ancient rules, bloodlines, village loyalties, feuds carried across generations. Luciano's structured, modern approach felt foreign to men who still believed power was inherited, not engineered. For the first time, his brilliance felt out of place. Reaching across an ocean, Luciano tried to maintain influence in America through coded conversations and the loyalty of old allies. Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and others visited discreetly, seeking guidance. But advice from across the ocean is a fragile form of power. A suggestion cannot command. A warning cannot enforce. The commission continued without him. The families evolved without him. The empire ran on the rules he'd written, but no longer needed the man who wrote them. He felt it in every visit. Respect remained, but relevance slipped away. A brief return to the world of power. Havana in the late 1940s, Luciano found a temporary resurrection in Havana. With Lansky's help, he entered Cuba quietly and moved once again through casinos, nightclubs, and backroom negotiations. In Havana, the air felt familiar. Money flowing, alliances forming, danger humming quietly in every corner. For a moment he felt like himself again. A strategist. A presence. A king. But the illusion shattered quickly. The U.S. government discovered he was there. Pressure mounted. Luciano was arrested and deported once more, this time with the certainty that he would never return to the world where his power truly lived. The brief spark of Havana became his final taste of influence. The slow erosion of power back in Italy, Luciano lived like a ghost of his former life. He walked through Naples observing a world that no longer needed his vision. He received fewer visitors. The American Mafia grew younger, hungrier, more reckless. Narcotics empires rose. New bosses established themselves. Decisions were made without him, not out of disrespect but out of necessity. Legacy had begun to replace leadership. Luciano felt a loneliness deeper than any prison sentence. He had built an empire designed to function without a dictator, and it succeeded. Too well. Reflection becomes the final companion in quiet apartments and seaside cafes. Luciano replayed the night that changed everything. The night he chose evolution over tradition, order over chaos, vision over obedience. That night built the modern Mafia. It also built the conditions for his exile. Because a system that no longer needs kings eventually outgrows the king who created it. The end of the journey on January 26, 1962, Luciano collapsed at Naples airport after meeting a producer about a film on his life. Even at the end, he was trying to control the narrative, to define a legacy slipping further from his grasp. He died far from the empire he created, far from the streets that shaped him, far from the men who once followed his every word. A king without a kingdom, but a legacy that would rule long after he was gone.